Reinhard Hütter is professor of Christian theology at the Duke University Divinity School. He holds a doctorate of theology from the University of Erlangen. He has held visiting fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Studies of Religion at the University of Chicago and the Center of Theological Inquiry at Princeton, and has been a visiting professor at the University of Vienna. An author of multiple scholarly books, articles, reviews, and translations, Professor Hütter's books include Ressourcement Thomism, Sacred Doctrine, the Sacraments, and the Moral Life, and most recently, Dust Bound for Heaven, Explorations in the Theology of Thomas Aquinas. He will speak today on the freedom of truth, the nature of conscience in Aquinas and Newman. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming on this gloomy Chicago afternoon. I've lived in Hyde Park for 9 years, so I know what it's like. Spring is going to come, I can assure you, for those of you who haven't lived that long in Chicago, at around end of June or so, it will be spring. Just kidding. I want to thank, first and foremost, Thomas Lethergood for the invitation to come here, my good friend and student, John Buckman, for his introduction. And my opening joke that I normally make as an icebreaker doesn't work here. Down south, where I normally lecture, I tend to say the funny accent with which I speak accounts for the fact that I've lived 9 years in Chicago. So the south doesn't really work at all for that. So I am a German still, and that accounts for the funny way of speaking here. I should say that the title has changed a little bit, not that much. The title of the lecture I'm going to give you now is Freedom of Conscience as Freedom in the Truth, Conscience according to Thomas Aquinas and John Henry Newman. I should also say that I have dedicated this lecture to the memory of Jean Bethke Elstein, who was a valued friend and colleague, especially during the years that I taught myself here across the street on the other side of 55th Street. And I would have very much liked to see her in person here today. And she's a loss to all of us. On December 27, 1874, England's arguably greatest theologian of that century, John Henry Cardinal Newman, at the age of 73, published a famous open letter. The letter was addressed to the Duke of Norfolk, who was a fellow Catholic and a graduate of Newman's oratory school in Birmingham. Newman penned this letter in response to an intensely polemical pamphlet, The Vatican Decrees in Their Bearing on Civil Allegiance. The author of this diatribe was none other than the Liberal Prime Minister of England, William Gladstone. In his pamphlet, Gladstone had taken the promulgation of the dogma of papal infallibility at the Vatican Council in 1870 as an occasion to argue that Catholic subjects of Her Majesty, committed to papal infallibility, could no longer, quote, be trusted to participate loyally and thoughtfully in the nation's civic life, unquote. In his open letter, Newman offered a bristlingly brilliant refutation of this and other related allegations advanced by Gladstone. More importantly, however, the open letter offered Newman the welcome opportunity to present a condensed account of his understanding of conscience. Not only the conscience of Catholics, but conscience in general. Newman's reflections on conscience are the mature fruit of a lifetime of an intense preoccupation as preacher, polemicist, philosopher, and theologian with the phenomenon of conscience. Were Newman ever to be declared a doctor of the Church, he might most appropriately receive the title Doctor of Conscience. And the possibly most telling epitaph justifying this title can be found in the rightly famous concluding lines of the section in his open letter entitled Conscience. Quote, If I am obliged to bring religion into after-dinner toasts, I shall drink to the Pope, if you please, still to conscience first and to the Pope afterwards." Unquote. What is Newman trying to say? Isolated from the thrust of the argument of Newman's open letter, a letter, mind you, that in the 1888 edition fills 203 pages, the concluding statement of the section on conscience has suffered the fate of being misinterpreted in a way that is in blatant contradiction to the thrust of the argument jumping off the pages of Newman's letter. This popular misinterpretation tends to go along the lines of the following syllogism. Major premise: freedom of conscience signifies the sovereign act of my will, to which all external instruction and guidance are secondary, be they divine or human. Minor premise: papal teaching is an instantiation of external instruction and guidance. Ergo, the freedom of conscience trumps papal teaching. And therefore, indeed, conscience, so-called, first, the Pope, if at all, at best, second. The problem with this erroneous interpretation of Newman's after-dinner toast is twofold. First, the syllogism on which it relies rests on a false major premise, a premise built upon a counterfeit of conscience, and second, on an underdeveloped and hence at best misleading minor premise. In order to capture the true meaning of Newman's after-dinner toast and the precise understanding of freedom of conscience entailed in it, one must gain first a sound understanding of the notion of conscience with which Newman operates, and secondly, a fuller appreciation of the precise role of the Pope's Magisterium in relationship to conscience in its true sense. I shall argue in this lecture that according to Aquinas and Newman, conscience is essentially theonomic. Due to its theonomic nature, conscience engenders a positive freedom in the truth. This freedom stands, as I shall argue, in sharp contrast to the negative freedom characteristic of the counterfeit of conscience, a freedom that protects from interior and exterior interference the sovereign rule of self-will. But before we plunge into theoretical considerations about conscience, allow me to display briefly Newman's understanding of conscience in concrete operation by attending to two hypothetical cases that Newman entertains. The obvious occasion at hand for these cases was Prime Minister Gladstone's allegation of the inherently divided allegiance of Catholics between loyalty to their nation and obedience to the Pope. Before Newman considers any concrete scenario, he makes a point of central importance for the context in which the cases of conflict must be understood. In virtue of the fundamentally different functions of state and church, Newman states that, quote, "the circumference of state jurisdiction and of papal are for the most part quite apart from each other. They are just some few degrees out of the 360 in which they intersect." Unquote. But what if such a conflict would occur in the few degrees in which state and papal jurisdiction did indeed intersect? To address this worry, Newman considers several hypothetical cases. Here is one of them, quote, "Were I a soldier or sailor in Her Majesty's service and sent to take part in a war which I could not in my conscience see to be unjust, and should the Pope suddenly bid all Catholic soldiers and sailors to retire from the service, taking the advice of others as best as I could, I should not obey him." Unquote. You can, of course, appropriately update this example. Let us assume Newman served in the British Navy during the time, some of us remember that, during the time of the 1982 Argentine occupation of the Falkland Islands. Remember that, Thomas? See? And let us furthermore hypothetically assume that the Pope asked all Catholic soldiers and sailors in the British Navy to retire from their service, because Argentina might considerably have a not altogether illegitimate claim upon the Falkland Islands, and because in this particularly perplexing case, no obviously just defense of national territory obtained, and therefore Catholics should abstain from fighting in such a war. And let us assume that Newman, after inquiring seriously into the matter and after taking counsel from others, in his conscience would have been unable to conceive the liberation of the Falkland Islands from Argentine occupation an unjust war, he might not have obeyed the hypothetical papal instruction, but rather followed what his government mandated him to do. Let us consider another hypothetical case Newman offers. Quote, suppose, for instance, an act was passed in Parliament bidding Catholics to attend Protestant service every week, and the Pope distinctly told us not to do so, for it was to violate our duty to our faith. I should obey the Pope and not the law. Unquote. It is not very difficult to transpose this example into our contemporary context. What if a contemporary British, or for that matter American government, were to create laws that would require Catholics, by complying with these laws, to violate their duty to the faith and morals as taught by the Church, and put themselves into the proximity of grave systemic moral evil, or make themselves even cooperate with such grave moral evil? And let us assume that the Pope, together with the Catholic bishops of such a country, had spoken out collectively and consistently against such laws. Newman's answer is clear: I should obey the Pope and not the law. Let us now make explicit some of the underlying assumptions hidden in Newman's two cases. First, popes are not infallible in particular political and practical judgments, where properly informed conscience might direct Newman and others to judge differently. However, when the Pope authoritatively affirms matters of faith and morals that are held definitively by the universal episcopal magisterium, he teaches infallibly and is owed assent of faith. And when the Pope teaches on matters of faith and morals by way of his ordinary papal magisterium, he is owed a reverent obedience, obsequium religiosum, from all properly informed consciences of Catholics. Second, while the state deserves the basic allegiance of all its citizens and hence the respect of its laws, the state has no legitimate authority in matters pertaining to the substance of faith and morals. Nor does the state have legitimate authority over matters that fall under the universal papal jurisdiction, that is, over matters that pertain to the specific organization of the life of faith, divine worship, the appointment of bishops, etc. Third, conscience is the interior forum, the forum internum, of religious and moral truth, a forum where legitimate claims upon one's allegiance are distinguished from illegitimate claims upon one's allegiance, where moral truth and hence obligation is perceived, and where consequently a clear imperative toward a certain course of moral action is voiced. Each of Newman's cases presupposes, first, the existence, and secondly, the proper formation and operation of conscience. Moreover, each case displays Newman's understanding of the freedom of conscience as a positive freedom in the truth. But what is conscience in the first place? And what, furthermore, does the freedom of conscience as a positive freedom in the truth mean? In the main bulk of this lecture, I will address these questions by advancing the combined wisdom of two eminent Catholic philosophers and theologians, John Henry Newman and Thomas Aquinas. Since the former, Newman, appeals to the latter, Aquinas, as an important warrant for his own doctrine in the open letter, I will take the occasion to nuance and deepen Newman's account of conscience with the help of Aquinas' teaching. Let us turn first to Newman. Newman is crystal clear about the fact that any proper understanding of conscience must first and foremost articulate the theonomic nature of conscience. Conscience is not simply a human faculty, but is in its root constituted by the eternal law, the divine wisdom communicated to the human intellect. In other words, conscience properly understood is always religious conscience, or else a counterfeit of conscience. It is upon its theonomic nature and upon it alone that the prerogatives and the supreme authority of conscience are founded. Newman states in his open letter, quote, "The supreme being is of a certain character, which expressed in human language we call ethical. He has the attributes of justice, truth, wisdom, sanctity, benevolence, and mercy as eternal characteristics in his nature, the very law of his being, identical with himself, and next, when he became creator, he implanted this law, which is himself, in the intelligence of all his rational creatures. The divine law, then, is the rule of ethical truth, the standard of right and wrong, a sovereign, irreversible, absolute authority in the presence of men and angels." Unquote. It's quite remarkable writing that to Gladstone. In stark contrast to the widespread fiction of wishful projection, the voice of conscience being the indulgent voice of a transcendent affirmer of our whims and wishes, the echo of the pronouncements of our sovereign self-will, Newman impresses to his readers the rather startling fact that, quote, "conscience is a messenger from him who both in nature and in grace speaks to us behind a veil and teaches and rules us by his representatives," unquote. Conscience denotes the received standard of moral truth in the human intellect and is in this precise sense theonomic, or differently put, religious all the way down. Now let us grant the religious nature of conscience. But what about Newman's stern theonomic specification? Quote, "The divine law, which is God himself, is a sovereign, irreversible, absolute authority in the presence of men and angels," unquote. Not only does Newman seem to be utterly insensitive to the tender feelings of all those who hold moral relativism and perspectivalism to be true, what is worse is Newman not invoking some obsolete dark image of the medieval mind or possibly his own personal obsession with a dictatorial, all too Old Testament-like Übervater, an allegedly harmful notion that, as the story goes, was finally abolished once and for all at the Second Vatican Council. Hardly so. Rather, the magisterial reception and explication of Vatican II gives us strong reasons to assume that Newman's understanding of conscience as essentially theonomic stands very much in the line of theological thought affirmed by the Council. For it is in the 1992 Catechism of the Catholic Church, in the context of the exposition of the teaching of Vatican II on conscience, where we find the citation of the above passage from Newman, culminating in the beautiful and memorable statement, quote, "Conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ," unquote. That's in the Catechism number 1778. In short, the Catechism presents Newman as invoking nothing but the common Christian understanding of conscience. And this is indeed what Newman explicitly says in his open letter, where he points to the broad consensus on the theonomic nature of conscience between Catholics and most Protestant groups in 19th century Britain. Quote, "When Anglicans, Wesleyans, the various Presbyterian sects in Scotland, and other denominations among us speak of conscience, they mean what we mean, the voice of God in the nature and heart of man as distinct from the voice of revelation. They speak of a principle planted within us, before we have had any training, although training and experience are necessary for its strength, growth, and due formation. They consider it, as Catholics consider it, to be the internal witness of both the existence and the law of God," unquote. Would that the American successors of these 19th century British Protestant denominations still today maintain in their official statements and policy recommendations this understanding of conscience as essentially theonomic that they once shared with the Catholic Church. Newman sees this common Christian understanding of conscience as essentially religious, as essentially theonomic, to stand in the strongest possible antithesis to a counterfeit of conscience that became rapidly influential in the wake of the ascendancy of the natural sciences, in the post-Enlightenment naturalist strands of modern thought in the 18th and 19th century, a notion that in the latter part of Newman's life had become dominant in the world of the British educated elites. Instead of conscience being the voice of God in the precise sense of a participation of the human intellect in the eternal law, Newman observes, quote, "It is fashionable on all hands now to consider it in one way or another as a creation of man," unquote. Today, almost 150 years later, this counterfeit of conscience has ascended to the status of conventional wisdom among politicians, journalists, and the so-called person on the street. Among those still in the throngs of the modern turn to the subject, conscience, so-called, is now regarded as at best a desire to be consistent with oneself, a consistency constructed among the discrete dictates of the self-will. Among those who more recently have drunk from the wells of a neuroscientifically informed neo-Darwinian sociobiology, conscience has become nothing but a noble word for a long-sighted selfishness, a selfishness of our genes or ourselves as one particular species of niche-producing organisms. In short, a selfishness of forces beyond our control, forces for which we are therefore not accountable. Newman already felt the early waves of this dramatic denial of theonomic conscience implanted in the human intellect throughout most of his adult lifetime. Quote, "All through my day, there has been a resolute warfare. I had almost said conspiracy against the rights of conscience. We are told that conscience is but a twist in primitive and untutored man, that its dictate is an imagination, that the very notion of guiltiness which that dictate enforces is simply irrational. For how can there possibly be freedom of will? How can there be consequent responsibility in that infinite eternal network of cause and effect in which we helplessly lie? And what retribution have we to fear when we have no real choice to do good or evil?" Unquote. On the assumption that God does not exist and the human beings are causally determined in their acts, be it by the survival interests of their genes or by their socio-economic environments and family systems, or by their respective id or subconsciousness, or by a combination of all these factors. In other words, on the assumption that the threefold humiliation of human conscience and moral agency at the hands of Darwin, Marx, and Freud obtains, what is the point of continuing to appeal to one's conscience or to that of others? It being presumably pointless, one would expect that in an increasingly secular culture, the appeal to conscience would have faded away. But this is not the case, as any observer of public and political life in late modern democracies is only too well aware of. Newman was uncannily prescient in anticipating what has by now become a distinctly late modern way of appealing to the counterfeit of conscience. Quote, "When men advocate the rights of conscience, they in no sense mean the rights of the Creator, nor the duty to him, in thought and deed, of the creature, but the right of thinking, speaking, writing, and acting according to their judgment or their humor, without any thought of God at all. Conscience has rights because it has duties. But in this age, with a large portion of the public, it is the very right and freedom of conscience to dispense with conscience, to ignore a lawgiver and judge, to be independent of unseen obligations. It becomes a license to take up any or no religion, to take up this or that, and let it go again. It is the right of self-will." Unquote. Unmoored from its theonomic anchorage, the word conscience simply comes to mean its counterfeit, the word now denoting nothing but the untutored, unformed, and unrestrained dictates of the sovereign rule of self-will. With a progressive rejection of theonomic conscience in Newman's day, and the increasing embrace of its counterfeit, the echo not of God's voice in the intellect, but of the will's self-assertion, much of late modern humanity in the Western Hemisphere has fallen from the freedom of accountable adulthood into the sentimental self-indulgence of a permanent adolescence, while much of contemporary postmodern humanity runs the danger of resigning itself to the sweeping moral unaccountability of an advanced primate, equipped with consciousness, but devoid of, or as some would put it, free from, conscience properly understood. Consciousness, yes. Conscience, no. This denial of theonomic conscience, characteristic of the human as a person, and the simultaneous affirmation of the consciousness characteristic of an advanced primate, turns out to be perfectly compatible with an inflationary rhetorical appeal in the public realm and in interpersonal communication to conscience, that is, of course, to the counterfeit of conscience. In light of this rapid dramatic transignification of conscience during Newman's own lifetime, it is of special significance that Newman does not deem it necessary to advance some philosophical demonstration that would prove the existence of a theonomic conscience. For those who have faith, divine revelation and the Church's consistent teaching about conscience authoritatively establish in one stroke the existence as well as theonomic nature of conscience. Moreover, Newman would assume that those who have faith would also experience the theonomic reality of conscience in a perspicuity that a philosophical demonstration could hardly improve upon. For those without faith, and for those who hold a notion of conscience warped by erroneous opinions, Newman seems to assume that the inescapable experience of the interior forum would eventually produce the kind of evidence of the theonomic conscience that no philosophical demonstration could hope to achieve. Theonomic conscience in Newman's eyes is an aboriginal datum of the human mind conveying the first principles of moral truth, principles similar to the principle of non-contradiction. As the principle of non-contradiction cannot be demonstrated, but serves as the basis for proving other truths, in a similar way the first principles of the theonomic conscience cannot be demonstrated by a proof. Rather, their self-evidence serves as the basis for proving other truths. For Newman, for example, the existence of God. So faced with a counterfeit of conscience, Newman simply trusts that the ontological truth of theonomic conscience, its objective reality and its eventual operation will again and again break through the layers of self-deception and thereby establish the only persuasive evidence of its existence. And therefore, in the very presence of the counterfeit of conscience, Newman continues to use, quote, the word conscience in the high sense as a dutiful obedience to what claims to be a divine voice speaking within us, and that this is the view properly to be taken of it. I shall not attempt to prove here, but I shall assume it as a first principle, unquote. Theonomic conscience is quite distinctly discernible in that it bears immediately on conduct, on something to be done or not done. Following a veritable tradition of Catholic teaching on conscience, Newman understands conscience to have two distinct functions. There is first and foremost what he calls, with Augustine, the echo of the divine voice within us, this echo being nothing but the presence of the first principle of moral truth in the intellect. And there is secondly the practical dictate about what here and now is to be done as good or avoided as evil. It is interestingly at this very point that Newman turns to Aquinas and draws upon his doctrine of conscience. So we turn with Newman now to Thomas Aquinas, who allows Newman to deepen his account of conscience. First, Newman points to the deep congruence between Augustine and Aquinas on the theonomic nature of conscience. Quote, the eternal law, says Augustine, is the divine reason of or will of God, commanding the observance, forbidding the disturbance of the natural order of things, unquote. But how are the divine law and conscience connected? In order to answer this question, Newman turns from Augustine to Aquinas. Quote, the natural law, says Thomas Aquinas, is an impression of the divine light in us, a participation of the eternal law in the rational creature. This law, as apprehended in the minds of individual people, is called conscience, and though it may suffer refraction in passing into the intellectual medium of each, it is not therefore so affected as to lose its character of being the divine law, but still has, as such, the prerogative of commanding obedience, unquote. Newman draws in his characterization of Aquinas on a crucial distinction at the very center of Aquinas' doctrine of conscience, a distinction between a fundamental level of innate principles ready to be activated, Aquinas calls this synderesis, and an application of these principles to concrete actions, an application that Aquinas calls conscientia, knowing together, of the first principles with concrete acts. Let us first consider the fundamental ontological level of conscience. Aquinas uses for this level a technical term provided by the tradition and afloat among the scholastics in the 13th century and employed even in later times. Synderesis is the term. Thomas understands synderesis as a natural habitus of first principles of action, which are the universal principles of the natural law. A natural habitus of the intellect, synderesis is an innate quality of the intellect, a primordial perception of the good proper to the human being. This innate perception engenders a natural inclination to the good. Remember, Aquinas teaches the convertibility of truth and goodness, truth being the good of the intellect and the good being the truth which the will desires. Hence, the natural habitus of first principles of action is inherently oriented to truth. It is this urgency of the truth within the good, within the very attraction of the good, that is at the heart of the intimate awareness of duty and obligation, according to Thomas. Not only does synderesis incite to good and murmur at evil, but it also contains the first precept of the natural law, that good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. It is in virtue of the natural habitus of synderesis that human reason participates in the eternal law. In short, synderesis is participated theonomy. Let us now turn to the actualization of the habitus of synderesis, conscientia, knowing together. Conscientia names first the actualization of the natural habitus of the first principles of moral truth, and second, the application of this knowledge to action, a kind of dictate of reason. This is the aspect of conscience that Newman understands to be a particular dictate bearing immediately on what is to be done. Quote, conscience, says St. Thomas, is the practical judgment or dictate of reason by which we judge what hic et nunc, here and now, is to be done as being good or to be avoided as evil, unquote. The late Thomist philosopher Ralph McInerney put it thus, quote, conscience is a particular judgment as to what is to be done in the light of a common principle. The term means the act of application, but it can also mean the judgment made, as when someone tells us what his conscience tells him, unquote. Aquinas spells out the dynamic of this judgment of conscience in instructive detail. Quote, conscience is said to witness, to bind, or incite, and also to accuse, torment, or rebuke. And so the judgment of conscience can occur in three ways. The first way is retrospective and testificatory, insofar as we recognize that we have done or not done something. Here Thomas refers to Ecclesiastes 7:23. Your conscience knows that you have often spoken evil of others. The second way is prospective and exhortatory, so far as through the conscience we judge that something should be done or not done, and in this sense conscience is said to incite or to bind. The third way is evaluative, so far as by conscience we judge that something done is well done or ill done. and in this sense conscience is said to excuse, accuse, or torment." Unquote. Aquinas' account of the ways of judgment of conscience is not only remarkably comprehensive but also psychologically astute. In unison with Aquinas, Newman does regard the natural habitus of synderesis as universal, albeit the concrete exercise of conscientia as religiously, culturally, and historically sharpened or blunted. Hence, as already discussed earlier, Newman can forego any attempt at proving the existence of conscience to its detractors, while those who embrace the sovereign rule of self-will can deny, suppress, and flee from the interior forum. They can never escape the eventual interior manifestation of the anomic conscience. In order to do full justice to Aquinas' doctrine of conscience, we must briefly consider three crucial aspects. First, the surpassing importance of synderesis. Second, the instructive difference between the operation of conscience, conscientia, and the virtue of prudence. And third, the perplexing but well-known phenomenon of the erroneous conscience. First, synderesis. What is that exactly? The late Servius Pinckaers, doyen of post-Vatican II Thomist moral theology, aptly put it. Synderesis offers a solid base for the recognition of the universal and permanent character of moral laws coming from within us in the form of a light that illuminates our intellect. The strength of moral law derived from this light does not come to human beings from a merely exterior will. It has its root in our intellect and is at the origin of our freedom." Unquote. Synderesis is an interior illumination of the intellect, the gift of a first principle and a first precept that subsist in the intellect as a natural habitus. Because synderesis is a transcending participation of the divine truth, it engenders the positive freedom of conscience in the truth. Following Aquinas, Pinckaers likens synderesis to a spark, quote, the purest part of fire, which shoots out above the flame and distinguishes it from the fire itself, which is mixed with alien matter that alters its purity. The spark of synderesis, the pure light of truth. The fire is conscience, which can err accidentally by attaching itself to a particular object that is inferior to reason. Synderesis is, strictly speaking, the spark of conscience, the origin of the light that illuminates it. Unquote. Because synderesis is essentially illumination, it prevents the dictates of conscience from ever turning into some imposed heteronomy. Rather, the truth of the first principles of action shines up within human reason itself. For this reason, synderesis remains untouched by the dichotomy between heteronomy and autonomy, a conceptual problem that haunts most modern moral philosophy. Because the human being is a creature of a very unique kind, a rational being created in the image of God, the innate first principles of understanding and acting are a proprium of human nature. This natural habitus accounts for the theonomic nature of conscience and for its positive freedom in the truth. Due to synderesis, participated theonomy transcends the paralyzing opposition of heteronomy and autonomy. Let us turn secondly to the instructive difference between the operation of conscientia and the cardinal virtue of prudence. Pinckaers observes that, quote, conscience, although it judges the moral quality of our behavior, is not a virtue. It is the application of synderesis in the appraisal of acts we have carried out or will carry out, unquote. And indeed, for Aquinas, conscience and prudence are not synonyms, and hence it is necessary to keep the judgments of conscience and the judgments of the cardinal virtue of prudence distinct. as Ralph McInerney aptly put it, quote, "To have cognitive knowledge of what I ought to do here and now is not a function of, is not dependent upon, being related to the good known as good. A bad person can have a correct conscience. The correctness of conscience does not of itself guarantee that action and choice will be in accord with it. The morally weak person, the incontinent person, knows what he or she ought to do. His or her conscience is all right, but his or her knowledge of the good is not complemented by an effective, appetitive disposition to good as good. And that is why in the crunch, in choosing, he or she goes wrong. The proper operation of conscience remains, indeed, testificatory, exhortatory, and evaluatory. Conscience is not in and of itself efficacious in choosing and doing the good. For this, the cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, courage, and temperance are indispensable. Theonomic conscience convicts the adulterer of the act of adultery, but cannot on its own prevent an act of adultery, nor reform on its own the adulterer's habituation in this vice. To put it differently, theonomic conscience is the necessary basis of and starting point for moral goodness, and indeed holiness of life, for it is the synderistic truth indicator of such a life. But it is not sufficient for the attainment of such a life. Conscience, to be precise, a well-formed and soundly instructed conscience, is indispensable, but far from sufficient for choosing and doing the good. Let us touch thirdly on the complicated topic of the erroneous conscience. The operation of conscientia, the application of the universal principles of synderesis to the particular deeds, is not infallible. The judgment of conscientia can be wrong. And in such a case we talk about an erroneous conscience. McInerney states, quote, "An erroneous conscience is an instance of ignorance, of not knowing the correct assessment of a proposed course of action. If the ignorance in which one acts is voluntary, then it does not excuse. It may be indirectly voluntary if it is a matter of negligence, if one not putting his mind to know what he is held to know." Unquote. Vatican II's pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes, insists that it is not rare for conscience to err from invincible ignorance without losing its dignity. This is, of course, right. Even a conscience that is erroneous due to invincible ignorance carries the dignity of conscience. But in order not to commit a serious misunderstanding, the following is crucial to keep in mind. Gaudium et Spes emphasizes explicitly that the very obedience to the law written by God into the heart is the dignity of the human person. Drawing upon this principle, the later encyclical Veritatis Splendor by John Paul II concludes, "It is always from the truth that the dignity of conscience derives." Hence, when erroneous due to invincible ignorance, the dignity of conscience rests in its infallible theonomic root, in the first principles of synderesis, in the divine origin of the light that illumines conscience, and not in the erroneous judgments of conscientia. Furthermore, invincible ignorance cannot simply be a state of ongoing moral existence, but rather denotes an extraordinary temporary phenomenon, though one that can last for a considerable amount of time. A phenomenon arising from a unique constellation of subjective obstacles, none of which, however, are in principle unsurmountable. In other words, invincible ignorance can never be a proper attribute of theonomic conscience per se. It can only be an accidental attribute denoting a contingent deficiency called circumstantial ignorance. The state of moral perplexity, perplexitas, might indeed obtain for a conscience, however, never in principle, but only as an instance of ignorance of not knowing the correct assessment of a proper course of action. Since the dictate of conscience binds and must be obeyed, an erroneous dictate of conscience must, of course, also be obeyed. What is to be learned from the concept of the erroneous conscience, and how does it differ from the counterfeit of conscience? First, the concept of the erroneous conscience entails an objective moral order and real moral knowledge. For a consistent moral subjectivism and the concomitant rule of self-will, on the contrary, an erroneous conscience is an utterly meaningless notion. By creating its own dictates of self-will, the subjectivist counterfeit of conscience is by definition infallible. Because it is the law of its own dictates, there is nothing in light of which the counterfeit of conscience can err. Second, the concept of the erroneous conscience entails the duty always to inform one's conscience better, to seek counsel, to have one's conscience formed by those one regards as wiser and better informed than oneself, and first and foremost to seek guidance from those whose specific vocation is to offer to theonomic conscience the instruction of the divine law, natural and revealed. This means, third, that for the Catholic, the prime tutor of conscience must be the Church's own moral instruction, undertaken by those appointed to teach authoritatively, the universal magisterium of the bishops and the ordinary magisterium of the Bishop of Rome. To many a contemporary Catholic, in Europe as well as in America, any strong notion of magisterial competency, let alone authority, and especially infallibility, in matters of faith and morals, is very hard, if not impossible, to swallow. For such a notion seems to contradict the very dignity and freedom of conscience. Newman is keenly aware of the danger for Catholics living under the dominant conditions of modern subjectivity to capitulate to the counterfeit of conscience. Consider what Newman has to say about the manner in which a well-formed conscience must regard papal instruction, even in those matters that do not fall under papal infallibility. Quote, again from his open letter to Gladstone. When conscience has the right of opposing the supreme, though not infallible authority of the Pope, it must be something more than that miserable counterfeit which, as I have said above, goes by the name. If in a particular case it is to be taken as a sacred and sovereign monitor, its dictate, in order to prevail against the voice of the Pope, must follow upon serious thought, prayer, and all available means of arriving at a right judgment on the matter in question. And further, obedience to the Pope is what is called in possession, that is, the onus probandi of establishing a case against the Pope lies, as in all cases of exception, on the side of conscience. Unless a person is able to say to himself, as in the presence of God, that he must not and dare not act upon the papal injunction, he is bound to obey it and would commit a great sin in disobeying it. Prima facie, it is his bounden duty, even from a sentiment of loyalty, to believe the Pope right and act accordingly, unquote. And then, a little bit further, one paragraph further, he continues to press the point home by saying, we must vanquish that mean, ungenerous, selfish, vulgar spirit. He must vanquish that mean, ungenerous, selfish, vulgar spirit of his nature, which at the very first rumor of a command places itself in opposition to the superior who gives it, asks itself whether he is not exceeding his right, and rejoices in a moral and practical matter to commence with skepticism, unquote. So what then is the proper relationship between theonomic conscience and the magisterium of the Catholic Church? very brief point here, conscience and the Magisterium. It is by now sufficiently obvious that Newman holds that there are two very different vicars of the one Christ who is the eternal Word of God, through whom the world was created, who became incarnate, and who, according to the Apostle Paul, was handed over to death for our sins and raised to life for our justification. As to the first vicar of Christ, the Word of God issues the spark of conscience, synderesis, the origin of the light that illumines reason by providing the natural habitus of the first principles of moral truth. Aquinas rather tersely identifies the office of synderesis as urging the good and murmuring at evil. Newman is pointing to no other reality at all, when with characteristic rhetorical force he states, quote, "Conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ, a prophet in its informations, a monarch in its peremptoriness, a priest in its blessings and anathemas." And, now he's pushing it, even though the eternal priesthood throughout the church could cease to be, in it, that means in conscience, the sacerdotal principle would remain and would have a sway. Unquote. Let us turn to the second vicar of Christ, the historical vicar of Christ, the Pope, either directly or indirectly through the universal magisterium of the bishops in union with him, informs, educates, instructs, and sharpens conscience such that its concrete operations transpire to an ever greater degree its transcendent theonomic illumination. Newman rightly emphasizes an obvious but often forgotten truth. The Pope's instruction presupposes the reality of conscience. Without the reality of conscience, the Pope's instruction could not be properly received. Quote, "Did the Pope speak against conscience in the true sense of the word, he would commit a suicidal act. He would be cutting the ground from under his feet. His very mission is to proclaim the moral law and to protect and strengthen that light which enlighteneth every man that cometh into the world. On the law of conscience and its sacredness are founded both his authority in theory and his power in fact. It is by the universal sense of right and wrong, the consciousness of transgression, the pangs of guilt, and the dread of retribution, as first principles deeply lodged in the heart of humans. It is thus and only thus that the Pope has gained his footing in the world and achieved his success." Unquote. At the same time, conscience needs the Pope's protection from being muted or repressed by its counterfeit, the sovereign rule of self-will. Newman states, quote, "It is the Pope's claim to come from the divine lawgiver in order to elicit, protect, and enforce those truths which the lawgiver has sown in our very nature. It is this and this only that is the explanation of his length of life more than antediluvian. The championship of the moral law and of conscience is the Pope's raison d'être. The fact of his mission is the answer to the complaints of those who feel the insufficiency of the natural light, and the insufficiency of that light is the justification of his mission." Unquote. Newman is keenly aware that while the theonomic illumination of conscience synderesis will eventually always break through with its own interior evidence, this echo of the divine voice can nevertheless be all too easily ignored, muted, or distorted, such that the judgments of conscience become erroneous. Quote, "The sense of right and wrong is so delicate, so fitful, so easily puzzled, obscured, perverted, so subtle in its argumentative methods, so impressible by education, so biased by pride and passion, so unsteady in its course, that in the struggle for existence amid the various exercises and triumphs of the human intellect, this sense is at once the highest of all teachers, yet the least luminous, and the Church, the Pope, the hierarchy are, in the divine purpose, the supply of an urgent demand." Unquote. The Church's mission through the universal magisterium of the bishops, and especially through the magisterium of the Pope, is nothing but to support and strengthen the divine spark of conscience synderesis by reaffirming explicitly the first principles of moral action, and to form the conscience by making explicit the precepts of the natural law, and by confirming and extending them through the catechesis of the divine law. Let us ask ourselves, what else does Pope Francis do by word and witness in the course of his public papal ministry, next to proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ, but to instruct and thereby form the conscience of Catholics and all persons of goodwill? And so it is indeed the case, as Ralph McInerney states, that, quote, St. Thomas would agree with the order of precedence in Newman's toast. First to conscience, then to the Pope, since this means God first, then the Pope, unquote. For Newman's sequence, conscience first, the Pope second, rests on the theonomic constitution of conscience and not on the sovereign rule of the self-will, the very counterfeit of conscience. Listen again to Newman's formulation, but remember that for Newman the notion of religion he invokes is virtually identical with the notion of theonomy. For religion is all about the knowledge of and obedience to the holy will of God. Quote, if I am obliged to bring religion into after-dinner toasts, I shall drink to the Pope, if you please, still to conscience first, and to the Pope afterwards. So finally, the conclusion. Freedom of conscience as freedom in the truth. What is it, and why should it at all matter? Because conscience, rightly conceived, is theonomic in nature, the freedom of conscience can only be a freedom in the truth, as John Paul aptly put it in his encyclical Latter Veritatis Splendor. I have stolen it from there without announcing it earlier. Rather than being a negative freedom from the truth in order to safeguard the sovereign rule of the self-will, the freedom in the truth is a positive freedom that, enlightened by the spark of synderesis, seeks to realize the due moral good. The natural habitus of synderesis is an active potency that requires activation by way of conscientia and concrete realization by way of the moral virtues. The positive freedom characteristic of theonomic conscience always seeks its ongoing formation by way of counsel and instruction. Characteristic of theonomic conscience is the interior forum that gives rise to the inner dialogue of the human being with him or herself, an inner dialogue that is open and indeed ordered to the interior dialogue between the human person and God. God, who is not only the author of the law, but the one in whose image the human being is created and who is the final end of the human being. As Pinker's rightly observes, theonomic conscience, quote, makes judgments in the presence of God by listening to his sovereign voice, and lets itself be judged by God and guided by his law through a fruitful, open, and intelligent obedience. Theonomic conscience always presents a challenge, like the steep and narrow way of the gospel that stands in stark contrast to the broad and easy way that leads to eternal sorrow, unquote. Wherever an appeal to conscience functions as a conversation stopper, as the last resort that brings any inquiry into the grounds for judgments made and actions done to an immediate stop, we have a strong indication that we are dealing with a counterfeit of conscience. This simulacrum camouflages the dictates of the sovereign self-will that has no other reasons to offer than its own de facto positing of a decision. The rhetorical appeal to conscience stands in service of the negative freedom of protecting the self-will from the challenges of the interior dialogue and from the probings of exterior moral interrogation. The inner dialogue occurring in the interior forum of the human being is, however, a proprium of mature personhood. Anamnetic witness, prospective exhortation, and accusatory evaluation are essential aspects of this inner dialogue. This dialogue can indeed be repressed or avoided thanks to the stratagems of the self-will, but only at the cost of diminishing one's own personhood and of foregoing the positive freedom that the theonomic conscience engenders. What if the negative freedom of the counterfeit of conscience becomes dominant in a culture by way of force, law, custom, or prejudice. The sovereign rule of the self-will and the concomitant appeal to the counterfeit of conscience might even become concentrated in a dominant political party or symbolically represented in a political leader. As a German who grew up in the second half of the 20th century, Nazism and communism have taught me: deny the reality of theonomic conscience, discourage, ridicule, and even attempt to suppress its proper and rightful exercise, and the outcome is a system of political barbarity. Nota bene, democratic regimes are not per se immune to this danger. If democratic regimes embrace as publicly normative a materialist or naturalist secularism and a concomitant moral and legal decisionism, and are bent on imposing this ideology upon the body politic, such secularist democratic regimes are prone to produce their own versions of barbarity, even if they are infinitely more subtle and refined than those typical of totalitarian regimes. If such a secularist democratic regime should impose laws that force individuals and institutions to cooperate with grave systemic moral evil, these laws contradict the constitutional freedom of religious exercise and compromise theonomic conscience. While such laws can never extinguish the spark of synderesis and can never repress the judgments of a properly informed conscience, such laws can indeed distort the original intent of the Constitution beyond recognition and can thereby inflict lasting damage to the body politic. A body politic in which the citizens are not merely free in a flat legal sense of the protection of individual rights, a purely negative freedom, but are expected to follow the judgments of an informed theonomic conscience, to exercise the positive freedom of conscience in the truth, is a political community that is substantively free. Enlightened by the spark of synderesis, the exercise of the properly formed conscience keeps this body politic, its laws and political processes accountable to the rule of ethical truth that applies to all political communities, even secularist democratic regimes. In whatever political community the negative freedom of the counterfeit of conscience has and will become dominant, by way of force, law, custom, or prejudice, the positive freedom of theonomic conscience in the truth has been and will be defended by acts of witness, that in their heroic extreme are traditionally called martyrdom. I thank you for your patience and for your attention.